This content is presented for educational and documentary purposes. It does not promote or glorify violence or criminal behavior. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to be remembered. Between 1974 and 1991, 10 lives are taken in Wichita, Kansas, and the criminal vanishes as if he never existed. Years later, he comes back. Not to ask for forgiveness, to ask for attention. He brands himself with 3 letters, BTK, and he spends decades living as a model citizen, churchgoer, family man, while the city tries to hunt a ghost who writes letters, taunts the police, and turns fear into his signature. But when the case goes cold, he returns from silence out of vanity, sending messages and a simple floppy disk, not realizing that was his own mistake. Who was this man, capable of switching between domestic routine and organized violence with almost clinical coldness? This is the story of Dennis Rader, BTK, the predator hiding in plain sight. Part 1. Opening the case file. Wichita, Kansas isn't the kind of place that usually shows up in the public imagination when people talk about serial killer country. It's a working, industrial, middle-class city, surrounded by open plains, with quiet residential neighborhoods, churches packed on Sundays, and a daily rhythm that, for decades, kept the feeling alive that the worst things in the world happened somewhere else. In the 1970s, while the United States was moving through a period of social unrest, post-Vietnam, a crisis of faith in institutions, a growing stream of headlines about urban violence, Wichita still saw itself as a relatively steady dot on the map. Predictable, hardworking, homey. That's exactly why the BTK case feels so corrosive, because it doesn't start like a movie. It starts like an ordinary morning, at an ordinary address, with an ordinary family. And then, the air changes. When the police arrive, they don't just find a crime. They find a kind of silence that feels wrong. The sense that someone entered that house not only to destroy lives, but to impose their own logic, an invisible signature. What opens there isn't just a call for service. It's a case file. Between 1974 and 1991, Wichita and nearby towns like Park City lived with the intermittent presence of a highly organized predator, someone who didn't strike in uncontrolled bursts, but in cycles: approach, selection, attack, disappearance. And more than that, someone who needed to be noticed. Dennis Rader, later identified as the killer known as BTK, would claim at least 10 murders, committed over nearly 2 decades, before disappearing for years and then resurfacing in a calculated way. But to understand why this case becomes so emblematic, you have to look at the institutional and cultural environment where it unfolded. In the 1970s and 1980s, serial murder investigations in the US were still maturing as a field. The very idea of a serial killer as a public category was taking shape during that period, alongside gradual advances in behavioral analysis and better information sharing across jurisdictions. Still, in mid-sized cities, the work was often fragmented. Teams changed, priorities shifted, technology was limited, and the collection and preservation of evidence depended heavily on local experience. In other words, there was competence and effort, but there was also the vulnerability of everyday police work when facing a patient criminal. And BTK was patient. Not in the human sense of the word, but in the strategic sense. He seemed to understand that a city doesn't live permanently on high alert. Life goes back to normal. Fear settles in. Attention fades. And it's in that gap, when the world lets its guard down, that an organized offender finds room to operate. Except unlike many criminals who stay completely hidden, BTK wanted to control something else too: the narrative. He wrote letters, provoked authorities, fed terror as if it were an experiment in psychological dominance. By doing that, he wasn't only attacking his direct victims, he was attacking the community's sense of safety. The question that takes hold isn't just who did this, but how can someone be so close without being seen? That's the most disturbing part, the closeness. Because Wichita wasn't dealing with an outsider, someone who blows through and disappears, someone who stands out. What would later come to light is the core of the BTK paradox, a criminal who, for decades, maintained an appearance of normalcy, family, community involvement, church life, while privately nurturing a fantasy of control and recognition. The case stretches across decades and changes shape as time passes. At first, there's shock and urgency. Then there's the bitter sense of an invisible enemy still out there. And then comes something even crueler: silence. For long stretches, BTK stops communicating and isn't caught. In many cases, that kind of gap might mean the offender died, moved away, got locked up for something else, or simply stopped. But here, the silence wasn't peace. It was an interval. In 2004, the name BTK begins haunting Wichita again when the author himself reestablishes contact, sending messages and materials that reignite the hunt and remind the city the past wasn't buried. It was just waiting to be reactivated. From there, the case takes on a second life and a new kind of tension. Because now it isn't just police trying to find a man, it's a man trying to prove he still controls the game. That return changes the psychological balance. It puts the offender back in the center of the board and forces investigators to deal with a difficult component: the killer's strategic vanity. And this is where modernity enters as a double-edged weapon. The same world that gives the offender ways to communicate and manipulate also gives investigators new technical possibilities. Among the elements that would become decisive was how authorities traced digital clues tied to a floppy disk sent during the communications. A detail that seems banal, but in cases like this can be the crack in the disguise. When Dennis Rader is arrested on February 25, 2005, that arrest doesn't just close an investigation, it ends an era of intermittent fear and public humiliation. A police chief would state plainly what Wichita had waited decades to hear: BTK had been captured. What comes afterward, confession, court, the structural details of the crime pattern, reveals it wasn't just violence. It was a theater of control, a criminal who wanted the city to remember the name he invented, who wanted the power to end lives and, at the same time, command the conversation about it. And that's how the BTK file opens completely. Because the case isn't only about how he killed, it's about how he lived among people, how he maintained a social mask, how he managed his urges and cycles, and how he turned the criminal act into a system of personal recognition. An organized predator doesn't rely only on force. He relies on patience, performance, and calculation. And in Wichita, for nearly 30 years, that calculation worked. Part 2. The mind behind the crimes. Before Wichita learned to say 3 letters like a sentence, BTK, Dennis Rader had already existed for decades. And that is maybe the first layer of horror in this case. He didn't appear as an outsider or as someone who seemed out of place. He grew up on the same ground, breathed the same air, walked the same streets, and learned early on the language people use to seem trustworthy. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945 in Kansas, and was the oldest of 4 brothers. The family had Lutheran religious roots, an environment of rules, morality, and routine. In later accounts, he described his childhood as marked by a feeling of emotional neglect, not necessarily explicit violence, but absence. Parents working a lot, little attention, little space to be seen as an individual. There's a specific kind of lack that doesn't scream but corrodes. The child learns that to exist they have to adapt, stay quiet, not be a burden. And when that mixes with a temperament that's already more introspective, the result can be an adult who doesn't know how to ask for affection, only how to earn control. As a teenager, Rader didn't fit the popular kid stereotype. He was described as someone who stayed on the margins, watching more than participating. And here's a crucial detail for understanding the future BTK: the habit of watching. Not every observer becomes a predator, of course. But in some organized criminal profiles, observation becomes training. It becomes a mental map. It becomes a way to feel powerful without having to expose yourself. In biographical material and later analyses, an unsettling detail shows up. Rader would report early fantasies of domination and control over women in vulnerable situations. This isn't something to treat as morbid curiosity, but as a risk signal. When someone's sexuality becomes tied, early on, to the idea of power and submission, pleasure stops being connection and becomes possession. The other person isn't a subject. They're an object in a script. His adult life, on the surface, looked like a predictable series of steps. In 1966, he joined the United States Air Force, served until 1970, and left with an honorable discharge at the rank of sergeant. Military experience often reinforces discipline, routines, and compartmentalization. The ability to separate internal boxes. Work is one box, family is another, desires are another. For a lot of people, that helps organize life. For someone with control fantasies and a need to dominate his own impulse, that compartmentalization can become a tool. A way to keep two lives running in parallel without one contaminating the other. Back in Kansas, Rader married Paula Dietz on May 22, 1971, in a Lutheran church ceremony. The couple would have 2 children. The point here isn't the irony of a married man being a criminal. That would be too simplistic. The point is the psychological function of that domestic life. For some organized offenders, family and work aren't just part of life. They're part of the mask. A setup that offers respectability, access to predictable routines, and most of all, a social image that disarms suspicion. He studied, worked, moved through the world. He earned a degree in administration of justice from Wichita State University in the late 1970s, something that on its own is a revealing detail. Dennis Rader wanted to be close to the world that would hunt him. Many organized criminals are fascinated by authority, rules, structure. Sometimes it isn't admiration, it's envy. It's the fantasy of being the law without being bound by it. And then there's the second life. Because while on the outside he built a story of normalcy, husband, father, worker, church participant, inside there was a private project, the need for symbolic control, the desire to be the author of a plot where someone always loses and he always wins. Later, Rader would become known precisely for turning crimes into communication, letters, taunts, demands for attention.
BTK wasn't just a label the media invented. It was a brand he wanted to impose. That matters psychologically. There are killers who want to disappear. There are others who want to exist in the public mind. Rader clearly belonged to the second group. Over time, he held roles that almost symbolically put power in his hands: security, enforcement, rules of conduct.
Biographical sources note he worked jobs involving inspection and later became a compliance officer and animal control officer in Park City, described by neighbors as rigid, sometimes overly zealous, the kind of person who measures the world with a ruler and wants to punish deviations. That matters because it points to a pattern: pleasure in commanding, in correcting, in forcing things into line. When that trait shows up in both public and secret life, it stops being coincidence and becomes a personality signature. At church, the image was even cleaner. Rader was a member of a Lutheran congregation in Wichita and even held a leadership position on the church council shortly before he was arrested. He also served as a scout leader. To an outside observer, that sounds like total contradiction. To a profiler, it sounds like camouflage strategy mixed with something deeper: the pull of moral authority. When someone with domination impulses moves toward structures that represent good, they may be chasing 2 things at once: a hiding place and legitimacy. Being seen as upright, respectable, and behind that, keeping the secret as a private source of power. Here's the central psychological mechanism of BTK. The double identity wasn't an accident. It was a system. Rader didn't seem to act like someone swept up in chaotic impulses. His profile fits more with an organized offender: planning, selection, approach, concealment, return to routine. This kind of criminal doesn't live in crime all the time. He lives in cycles, and the cycle often has very specific phases: frustration, fantasy, mental ritual, execution, relief, return to normal. In that return to normal, the offender can seem even calmer, even more present with family. Not because he repented, but because he discharged tension. Home becomes a stage for normalcy, while the mind, in secret, keeps the invisible trophy, the feeling of total control. And what Rader seemed to chase, again and again, wasn't just hurting someone, it was managing a narrative of superiority. That explains why, beyond the crimes, he fed contact with police and the media. He wanted to be at the center of the board. He wanted to be the author of fear. He wanted something ordinary life rarely gives someone with that kind of internal emptiness. Recognition. Not recognition as love, but as public submission. You're thinking about me. For a fragile ego with grandiose cravings, that's fuel. At the same time, he managed to sustain everyday life for decades. And that takes a specific skill, emotional compartmentalization. The dad who buys gifts and the criminal who plans an attack don't meet, in his head, as a contradiction. They exist in separate drawers. That separation is a psychological defense, and for offenders like this, it can also be a source of pleasure, the feeling of fooling the entire world. No one suspects. And every normal day is, for him, a quiet victory. When BTK starts communicating again in the 2000s after years of silence, that also reveals something about who Rader was. Someone who couldn't stand to disappear. The silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. And when he reappears, he doesn't reappear remorseful. He reappears taunting, testing the limits of his own myth. At the core, Dennis Rader's biography fits what scares the public most. Not the unknown monster, but the integrated man. The citizen who learns the social rules, who understands how to seem trustworthy, who uses institutions, family, church, work, as a shield. BTK isn't just a case about violence. It's a case about a mask. About how someone can carefully build a reputation that functions like an emotional alibi. And this is where the question shifts. It's not only who was Dennis Rader, it's what did he need to prove to himself? What was inside him that ordinary life, marriage, kids, a job, public faith didn't fill? Why did the feeling of control have to become so absolute that it turned people into pieces in a private theater? Those answers don't appear all at once. They emerge as the file moves forward, when the victims gain faces and stories, when the pattern reveals itself, when the investigation starts to see the man behind the signature. Part 3. Who these victims really were. When a case gets a nickname, BTK, there's a quiet risk. The attacker's name becomes the headline, and the victims become statistics. But behind those letters there were faces, routines, homes that smelled like coffee, calendars on the fridge, kids heading to school, adults worried about bills, simple, real plans. That's where the case becomes unbearable. He didn't attack characters. He attacked people. Officially, Dennis Rader was convicted of 10 homicides, committed between 1974 and 1991 in the Wichita, Kansas area. Most died by asphyxiation, strangulation, often involving some kind of binding, ligature. And one victim was killed by stabbing, an outlier from the pattern that still fits the central objective: dominate the scene and control another person's life. The victims didn't fit one single rigid social profile. There were adult women in ordinary routines. There was an entire family. There was an older person. What connected them wasn't a risky lifestyle, but everyday vulnerability. Doors, windows, predictable schedules, trust in their own neighborhood. In other words, BTK exploited a universal emotional place, the belief that home is a refuge. The case begins in a devastating way on January 15, 1974, with the Otero family. 4 people: Joseph Otero, 38, Julie Otero, 33, and 2 children, Joseph Joey Otero, 9, and Josephine Josie Otero, 11, were murdered inside their home. The violence of that first event wasn't only in the number, it was in the symbolism. A home invaded, parents and children targeted, the idea of domestic safety shattered. Wichita wasn't prepared for that, and maybe no city is when it suddenly realizes danger doesn't come from a dark alley but can walk in through the living room. Not long after, in April 1974, tragedy reaches Catherine Bright, 21. Her name carries a different kind of sadness. She wasn't just another incident. She became an essential piece in understanding BTK because the manner of death differs from what would repeat later. Catherine was killed by stabbing, in an attack that also involved violence against another person in the house who survived. That episode exposes something important about the attacker's mind. When the ideal control doesn't happen the way he planned, the aggression can change form, but the goal stays the same. In 1977, the case hits the city again with two names that would become landmarks of local terror. Shirley Vian, 24, was killed inside her home while her children were there, a detail that by itself expands the trauma. It's not only the direct victim, it's the entire family marked forever by being close to horror. And months later, Nancy Fox, 25, was murdered under circumstances that reinforced the sense of invasion and helplessness. Someone entered her life, decided her end, and left, as if the world were his private property. The years pass, and BTK reappears in an intermittent way, like a fever that fades and comes back. In 1985, Maureen Hedge, 53, is killed. In 1986, Vicki Wegerle, 28, loses her life. In 1991, Dolores Davis, 62, is murdered. Three names that show another cruel layer of this predator. He didn't depend on one specific moment of youth or one phase of life. He could wait, he could choose, he could come back years later. For the community, that's a kind of collective psychological torture. How do you keep living normally when the past can repeat itself at any time? When we look at the totality of these victims, what appears is a portrait of lives cut off at their most ordinary, and because of that, most human. They weren't famous people. They were people with ties, family, work, children, neighbors, church, habits, and each death leaves a trail that doesn't end at the funeral. It ends in empty chairs at family gatherings. It ends in kids growing up with absence. It ends in neighborhoods that start locking doors differently. It ends in a city that learns to mistrust silence. Over nearly 2 decades, BTK didn't just kill 10 people. He altered an entire place's sense of safety. And what makes it worse is that he wanted it to be felt. His later communication with police and media shows that for him, the victim wasn't only the person who died, it was also the people who stayed, who read, who feared, who imagined. That's why, when entering this file, you have to make a pact. Remember that every name here was a whole life, not a suspense chapter. The suspense exists, and it will grow, but it can't erase the moral center of the story. These people had futures. And it's exactly that stolen future that gives weight to the next section, because to understand how he was able to operate for so long, we'll need to face the design of the pattern, the modus operandi of an organized predator who turned control into method. Part 4, Behavioral Signature. BTK didn't move like someone blowing up in violence. He moved like someone executing a plan. And that difference changes everything. When an offender is organized, the crime stops being impulse and becomes a project, a mental construction that starts long before the attack and continues long after, like a memory he revisits. The very nickname he chose, BTK, bind, torture, kill, is already a declaration of method, a signature designed to be repeated and recognized. He wanted the city to understand it wasn't random, it wasn't a breakdown, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The choice of victims and total control. Rader tended to target people in ordinary routine situations with an emphasis on women, often in domestic settings, homes and neighborhoods where normalcy is the main security system. He watched, assessed vulnerabilities, and moved in like someone studying a target. That's a key point with an organized predator. He doesn't need to take unnecessary risks. He prefers to reduce the unpredictable. Even when the victim didn't fit a single unique profile, there were men and children among the dead, the constant element, the dynamics of the attack, dominate, bind, silence. The center of BTK's modus operandi was submission. Victims were bound and in most cases killed by strangulation, asphyxiation, sometimes with a ligature, sometimes by suffocation with a plastic bag, according to consolidated case accounts. That isn't a technical detail, it's a psychological portrait. Strangulation tends to signal closeness, prolonged control of the situation, and power over a person's last breath, a form of homicide that, in organized profiles, ties more to domination than to efficiency. And there's an important point for the public to understand without sensationalism. The plan doesn't always go perfectly. In the attack on Catherine Bright, for example, the death happened through stabbing, a deviation from the dominant pattern, something compatible with the idea that faced with resistance, interruption, or a momentary loss of ideal control, he shifted to another lethal means while keeping the same end goal. He also used a firearm as an instrument of intimidation in some incidents, but the BTK stamp wasn't the gunshot. It was the process of dominating and silencing. Items, rituals, and trophies, the afterlife of the crime. Another typical trait of organized criminals, and very evident with Rader, is that the crime doesn't end when he leaves the scene. For him, there was a second stage, taking something with him. Sources on the case record that he stole personal keepsakes, such as underwear, documents, and objects. The meaning of that runs deep. The object becomes private proof of power, an anchor to relive the fantasy. It isn't ordinary theft. It's a kind of symbolic collection. In profiling terms, that's close to the idea of a psychological trophy, something that lets the offender replay his own dominance without needing to commit a new crime immediately. Communication as a weapon, letters, taunts, and the need to be seen. BTK didn't just want to kill, he wanted to command fear. That's why an essential part of his modus operandi was communicating with authorities and the press. He wrote letters describing crimes, demanding attention, proposing names for himself, until BTK stuck as the brand. That contact is more than vanity. It's symbolic control, forcing the city to think about him, forcing the police to respond to the script he tried to impose. At least once in a defining moment of the story, the communication itself becomes an element of psychological cruelty. News reports indicate he even called in to report a crime, amplifying the sense of omnipresence and mockery. That's not a dramatic detail. It's part of the terror method. The BTK cycle. Spaced out attacks and a normal life, in between. The timing pattern is also a signature. Between 1974 and 1991, the homicides happened with gaps, and then there was a long silence until the return of messages in the early 2000s. For an organized offender, those blackouts don't necessarily mean moral change. They can mean internal reorganization. The fantasy is fed, public life continues, and the impulse is managed until a new opening appears. And here's the most frightening trait of BTK's modus operandi. For decades, he was able to switch between predator and ordinary citizen, maintaining routines and social ties while hiding a private system of domination. In the BTK file, then, the method isn't only how he killed, it's how he controlled. He controlled the environment, the home. He controlled the body, binding, strangulation. He controlled memory, trophies, and he controlled public discourse, letters and taunts. That's why the investigation wasn't just a hunt for a suspect. It was an attempt to defeat a man who wanted to be at the same time invisible and unforgettable. Part 5. The investigation and the hunt for the mind behind the crimes. Wichita didn't wake up in 1974 ready to hunt an organized serial killer. The city woke up ready for just another normal day. And that's why the first blow landed so brutally. When police started trying to put the pieces together, it didn't feel like there was a thread. It felt like there was an abyss. In the beginning, there was only what was left at the scenes. Cold evidence, human fallout, the kind of silence that hangs after the air has been ripped out of a house. A multiple homicide scene like the Otero family put immediate pressure on everyone. The community wanted fast answers, and police had to act without yet knowing they were stepping into a long war. A war against someone who didn't just kill, but managed his own risk. Investigators did what you do when chaos drops into your lap. They reconstructed routes, interviewed neighbors, cross-checked timelines, looked for any strange presence around the victims. The problem is, an organized predator can look like nothing. He doesn't show up shouting, he doesn't draw attention, he doesn't present an identity. He moves through routines like a shadow that leaves no clear memory. For a lot of people, it felt like the city had been attacked by a ghost. And then came the first calculated psychological strike: communication. When letters start showing up, messages where the offender introduces himself, taunts, suggests a nickname, demands attention, the investigation suddenly has an enemy who isn't only trying to get away, he's trying to steer the wheel. For police, that creates a dilemma. Ignoring him might shrink his stage, but it could also mean losing clues. Engaging him might feed his ego, but it could also be the chance to force a mistake. That's one of the keys to the BTK case. It wasn't just a search for DNA, fingerprints, or a witness. It was also a contest for psychological control. The letters worked like a second crime. Even when there wasn't a new body, there was a new impact. Renewed fear, media reignited, families forced to relive trauma through public reminders. And inside the investigation room, there was another tension. The offender seemed to understand the value of details. In cases like this, any information made public can become a compass the offender uses to adjust his behavior. So the hunt had to learn to operate in two realities at once: the concrete case and the theater the offender was trying to stage. As the years passed and new murders happened, what began to emerge was a pattern. Not a perfect pattern, but enough repetition to suggest a single author. Homes invaded, victims controlled, deaths usually by asphyxiation, strangulation, and the sense that the offender chose settings that gave him dominance. Police had to connect crimes separated by time, by neighborhoods, by circumstances. That's hard in any era, but it was even harder in decades when databases were limited. Coordination between units wasn't as smooth, and forensic technology didn't have today's reach. And here's the part of the investigation that's less cinematic and more real. It's made of missteps, team changes, promising leads that die on the vine, suspects who don't hold up. With every year without a solution, the case doesn't just go cold, it becomes an institutional weight. Because the city changes, officers retire, new cases pile up, and the BTK file risks becoming a paper monster, too big to forget, too old to solve. And still, the fear didn't go away. It only went dormant. BTK also seemed to understand time. His attacks were spaced out, and that confused the social radar. A killer who strikes every week creates constant panic and intense patrols. A killer who disappears for long stretches creates something else: the illusion that it's over. The city relaxes. Collective memory tries to move on. And for investigators, it becomes a cruel game. How do you keep full force against someone who might never show up again? But he did show up. And that return is a crucial turning point. In the early 2000s, when BTK starts communicating again, it isn't only the case that reignites, it's the offender's ego that becomes clearer. He didn't come back because he needed to commit a crime to survive. He came back because he needed relevance. He needed to feel he still had the power to grab the city by the collar and force it to look. And that's where the investigation gets sharper, because now there's something that didn't exist with the same intensity before: an active line of contact. Investigators understood that this offender wasn't only sending messages, he was looking for an emotional response. So the strategy became a blend of tactics: keep the public informed without handing control to the offender, use media in a calculated way, analyze language, terms, writing style, watch how he described his actions and how he wanted to be seen. In profiling, that matters. An organized, vain, controlling offender often leaves traces not through physical carelessness, but through psychological need. He wants to sign. And sometimes the signature is the weakness itself. The biggest operational pivot in the case happens when that vanity collides with technology. Across the communications, BTK sends materials and at a certain point uses a floppy disk. Investigators work that angle like they're looking for a crack in armor. It isn't police magic, it's patience, method, and a simple line of reasoning. People who feel superior tend to underestimate the risk in their own actions. From the floppy disk, investigators are able to trace metadata and connections that point to a specific environment, and suddenly, the ghost takes shape. It isn't only a shadow in the city anymore. It's someone who uses computers, who moves through institutions, who has a routine. The hunt becomes concrete. And then comes one of the tensest moments in any organized serial killer investigation, when police have to close in without spooking the target. Because an offender like this, once he senses a threat, can destroy evidence, change habits, vanish again. The net requires discretion, surveillance, data cross-checks, background verification, and above all, enough certainty to act without risking the wrong move. Dennis Rader's arrest in 2005 is the final collapse of the mask. For the city, it's like decades of paranoia finally got a face, but at the same time, it's the shock of discovering that face didn't look like a monster. It looked like an ordinary man, the kind of man who sits in a church pew, the kind of man who has a family, the kind of man who passes you in the grocery store. And for investigators, the capture doesn't end the work, it changes its phase. Because from there, another battle begins. The interrogation, verifying confessions, stitching each case together, and the responsibility of giving families something that comes close to answers. In the hunt for BTK, police didn't just defeat a criminal, they defeated a project of symbolic control. And that's the final irony. A man who wanted to command fear through communication ended up being brought down precisely because he couldn't stop talking. Part 6. The Endgame. Capture, Trial and Closure. BTK's downfall didn't happen in a cinematic chase or a shootout. It happened in the way that bruises an organized predator's ego the most, because of his own need to be recognized. After years of silence, Dennis Rader started provoking Wichita again in the early 2000s, re-establishing contact with the media and with police. He wanted to reopen the file, reignite fear, but most of all, he wanted to feel like he still controlled the conversation. And it was exactly in that need to be seen that investigators found an opening. When a criminal like BTK communicates, he leaves traces. Not always physical, sometimes digital, administrative, routine-based, vanity-driven. In 2005, after exchanges of messages and the sending of materials, police were able to push forward until they narrowed the suspect pool. The net tightened quietly, almost invisibly, because investigators knew, if he felt the pressure, he could vanish again. On February 25, 2005, shortly after noon, Dennis Rader was arrested while driving near his home in Park City, in the Wichita metro area. The arrest was clean, direct, almost mundane, and that's exactly why it was symbolic. The man who built a legend of terror was stopped in the middle of an ordinary day. According to reports, an officer asked if he knew why he was being taken downtown, and Rader replied that he had suspicions. That line isn't evidence of remorse. It's a snapshot of someone who, deep down, always knew the game could end, and still couldn't resist the urge to keep playing. From there, the operation was surgical. Teams from the Wichita Police Department, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and federal agents executed searches at his home, his vehicle, and places tied to his routine, including the church and the public library. Equipment and personal items were seized, with two goals in mind: confirm authorship with evidence and, at the same time, map the inner world of that man. Because in cases like this, the crime isn't just an act, it's a parallel life system. The next day at a press conference, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams was blunt. BTK is in custody. For a city that had lived with intermittent fear for decades, the words landed almost physically. They didn't bring anyone back, but they removed that invisible presence that had haunted the collective imagination. But for the psychology of the offender, what came next was even more revealing. During interrogations and the first hours after his capture, Rader showed a very specific kind of concern. He asked about the death penalty and pressed to know what his sentence would look like and where he would be housed, whether he'd be in a special unit or in with the crazies. That comment is an X-ray of priorities. In that moment, he wasn't asking about victims or families. He was calculating his own fate and trying to preserve, up to the last second, some sense of control over what came next. The court phase moved quickly. Instead of a long, risky trial, the case headed toward an outcome that exposes a cruel irony. The man who spent years writing to be noticed would end up describing himself in front of a judge. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. The record of that moment preserved in transcripts shows a defendant who doesn't perform emotion like someone remorseful. He behaves in a way more consistent with what criminology recognizes in organized profiles: controlled tone, straightforward speech, the posture of someone still trying to dominate his own story, as if he were describing a job and not shattered lives. This is where the case hits a point that's especially uncomfortable for the public: the contrast. In ordinary life, Rader was a father, husband, worker, religious and community figure. In court, he becomes, officially, what the city feared, and he does it without the dramatic monster mask. That contrast is what makes BTK get under your skin. The sense that evil sometimes doesn't scream. It manages. Sentencing came on August 18, 2005. 10 consecutive life sentences, totaling the equivalent of 175 years. A clear legal message that he would not return to society. And here it's worth an important note because a lot of people ask, why wasn't there a death sentence? The answer lies in the legal and time frame of the case. The murders occurred between 1974 and 1991, and the legal path ended with life imprisonment. The outcome, therefore, doesn't include last meal or last words as an execution. BTK wasn't sentenced to death. He was sentenced to disappear in life, in the custody of the state. Today, Dennis Rader remains incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Kansas, serving his sentences. Recent reporting continues to confirm he is imprisoned there, and that the case occasionally returns to the news through parallel investigations and long-term family impacts. The official ending looks simple: capture, confession, sentence. But the psychological ending is more complex. Because for someone like Rader, getting arrested isn't only losing freedom, it's losing the main fuel of his internal system, the illusion that he controls the narrative. And now, with the file closed in court, the question that remains is the most disturbing. And it's the one that opens the next section. What was inside him that demanded not only killing, but being remembered? Part 7. Psychological breakdown of the case. To understand Dennis Rader, BTK, you have to let go of the comforting fantasy that evil has a look. In the BTK file, the threat doesn't announce itself with a scary appearance, or a chaotic life, or an obvious history of marginalization. On the contrary, what makes this case so disturbing is how socially competent the mask was. For decades, Rader was the kind of man people describe with ready-made phrases: hardworking, involved with the church, a family man, known around the neighborhood. And that's exactly where the psychological analysis has to be careful, not to explain in a way that absolves, but to map what internal mechanisms allow someone to sustain two lives with that kind of coldness, and why violence for him wasn't an accident, but a system. The construction of the mask, the psychological usefulness of normalcy. The first question isn't, how did he fool everyone, but why did he need to fool them? In many organized offenders, a stable social life isn't just a parallel backdrop, it's a pillar of their psychological functioning. It serves specific functions. External camouflage, family, church, and work create a halo of trustworthiness. Rader didn't look like someone adrift. He looked like someone inside the rules. That lowers suspicion and provides predictable routines, fuel for a predator who likes planning. Internal compensation. For certain profiles, normalcy is also a way to keep the public's self intact. This isn't necessarily about moral guilt, but about narcissistic preservation. I'm respectable, therefore I'm special. The mask becomes a mirror. He looks at himself and sees a socially successful character. Duality as pleasure. The double life can become in itself a source of psychological excitement. Not excitement in a superficial sense, but in the sense of secret power. No one knows. The secret gives a sense of superiority and control. Every normal day is a quiet victory. This sorting helps explain why BTK's capture was so humiliating for him. It wasn't just losing freedom. It was watching the mask collapse, and with it, the fantasy of being untouchable. Rader also cultivated positions of micro-authority in the community and at work, something consistent with what appears in accounts of his public life: rigidity, a taste for rules, and for getting other people in line. That trait, when it shows up both in everyday life and in criminal life, usually points to a central axis of personality: the need for control as a way to ease internal insecurity. Need for recognition and symbolic control. Crime as a signature. BTK isn't just a sequence of homicides, it's a case of homicides with communication. And that changes the dominant type of motivation. Many criminals avoid contact because they want invisibility. Rader, on the contrary, sought contact at different moments, taunting and demanding attention, reopening dialogue with the city after years. That's compatible with the hypothesis that for him, the crime served a symbolic function. It wasn't enough to kill. He needed to mark the world with his own existence. There are two important psychological elements here: recognition as a substitute for connection. Some people, when they can't experience real intimacy, genuine bond, emotional exchange, start looking for substitutes. The pathological substitute is fear. If they can't be loved, they want to be feared. Fear guarantees presence. They're thinking about me. Control is a false cure for emptiness. Control creates an illusion of internal stability. Someone who feels small inside may try to become giant outside, not through merit but through domination. The crime becomes a way to flip their own story, from invisible to inevitable. That pattern shows up very clearly in Rader's return in 2004, when he starts sending messages and materials again, reigniting an investigation that was already seen as a cold case. Organized personality, planning, patience, and compartmentalization. BTK is often described as an organized offender. In accessible psychological terms, that means he didn't seem to act in chaotic emotional collapses, but in planned cycles, with the ability to wait and maintain self-control in everyday life. A key point here is compartmentalization. The mind divides life into drawers. In one drawer, the public persona, father, husband, citizen. In another, fantasies, resentments, internal scripts. In another, the criminal self. For many individuals, this would be unsustainable because moral awareness creates friction. But in profiles with emotional coldness and low empathy, compartmentalization can work like an engine. The person doesn't integrate the human consequences of what they do. They execute. That helps explain why, in court records and transcripts, Rader could describe his crimes in a controlled, almost bureaucratic way, as if he were reporting actions rather than lives. That tone doesn't prove a specific diagnosis, but it is compatible with a deep difficulty accessing the emotional dimension of other people's suffering. Probable dominant traits: narcissism, coldness, rigidity, and psychological sadism. Without stamping disorders as certainty, it's possible to identify patterns that resemble well-documented traits in clinical and criminological literature. Narcissism, traits. Narcissism here isn't ordinary vanity. It's the need to feel special, superior, entitled to a central place. BTK chose a name for himself, wanted to be recognized, wanted to drive the narrative, and seemed to feed off the public impact. That's compatible with narcissistic traits, the pursuit of grandiosity and a dependence on attention. Coldness and low empathy, antisocial traits. The ability to harm and go home as if nothing happened is often compatible with antisocial traits, not in the sense of a shy person, but in the sense of extreme moral violation with little remorse. The way he sustained the double life for decades reinforces that. Rigidity and need for order, obsessive traits. There are indications of behavioral rigidity and a taste for control. In some individuals, this functions as an attempt to dominate internal anxiety. If the world is ordered, the person feels less threatened inside. Psychological sadism, not as spectacle but as function. What's observed in BTK is that the violence seemed tied to domination and total control. That can be compatible with patterns of sexual psychological sadism, when arousal and gratification are associated with power over the other and reducing the victim to an object. Biographical sources describe the case as driven by fantasies and by a bind, torture, kill logic as a signature. The central point, the combination of traits creates a dangerous functional profile. Narcissism fuels the need to be seen. Coldness allows action without collapse. Rigidity provides method. Sadism provides internal reward. Life context and possible roots. Emotional invisibility and fantasy. As a refuge. Psychological analysis doesn't need to invent a monstrous childhood to explain a criminal. Many individuals suffer neglect and don't become killers. But it's also true that certain contexts increase vulnerabilities. In various biographical narratives, Rader mentions feelings of emotional neglect and loneliness. Whether that was intense or not is hard to measure from the outside. But as a working hypothesis, it makes sense to think like this. A child who doesn't feel seen can develop two strategies. Either they desperately seek real attention, or they create an internal world where they're in charge. In many organized predators, fantasy becomes a secret room, an internal place of compensation. There he isn't small, he is sovereign. There he isn't ignored, he is feared. Fantasy offers what emotional life didn't offer: control, importance, centrality. And here, a critical turn happens, when fantasy stops being imagination and becomes a script. When the individual begins collecting symbols, watching targets, preparing mentally, the crime then becomes the realization of an internal narrative of domination. Stated motivation versus hidden motivation. Offenders like Rader may present surface justifications: boredom, curiosity, impulse, a bad side. But the deeper motivation is usually something else: repairing a wounded ego with a sensation of omnipotence. Stated motivation, what he might say: I wanted to, I felt like it, I couldn't stop. Hidden motivation, what shows up in the pattern: I needed to feel like God for a few minutes, I needed total control, I needed to be recognized, I needed to win against a feeling of insignificance. The renewed contact in 2004 is a great example. It wasn't necessary to survive. It was a return to the stage, a reactivation of a personal myth. The choice of victims as a psychological symbol. Rader had victims of different ages and different contexts, but the axis doesn't seem to be one specific social type, but the opportunity for domination, often in domestic environments, where routine and the sense of safety lower the guard. In symbolic terms, the home is a territory of intimacy and protection. When the offender enters it, he isn't just attacking a person, he's attacking the meaning of home. For a criminal obsessed with control, invading the house is like invading the other person's sovereignty and declaring, "My power reaches even where you think you're safe." When the case involves the Otero family, the symbolic dimension multiplies. Attacking an entire family is attacking the basic unit of belonging. It's not just violence, it's a display of absolute power over what society considers sacred. And afterward, Rader's public life, family, church, functions as psychological irony. He moves through the same symbols he destroyed. Triggers and escalation. Why do the crimes appear in waves? BTK didn't kill in weekly sequence. He acted in periods, with long gaps. That usually has several possible explanations, and analysis can point to combined hypotheses. Risk management. Organized offenders adjust behavior to avoid being caught. After a wave of crimes, they may cool off to reduce police pressure. Internal cycle of tension and relief. Some individuals build up frustration, resentment, fantasies, and the crime works like a discharge. After that, there's a period of calm, not out of remorse, but because the tension was drained. External changes. Work, family, routine can alter opportunities and time. An organized predator doesn't need to act constantly. He waits for the perfect moment. Feeding through fantasy and trophies. If the offender keeps objects, reminders, and memories, he can relive the crime mentally without needing to act again immediately. The return in 2004, after a years-long gap, suggests something even more revealing. The fuel wasn't only the act itself, it was also the public memory. He saw the case being remembered and, according to reports, that motivated him to resurface. That detail points to an ego dependent on a stage. Psychological function of the crime. What did the crime give him? In profiles like BTK, the question, what did he get out of it, has clear answers, even if uncomfortable. Sense of total power, power over the body, fear, the other person's fate. Control of time. He decides when it starts and when it ends. Symbolic control. By writing letters and taunting, he tries to control the public narrative. Identity. BTK isn't just a nickname, it's an identity built to fill a void. Relief of internal tension. The crime as a discharge of fantasies and frustrations. Secret superiority. The feeling of, I'm smarter than all of you. The irony is that this superiority was fragile. It depended on silence, secrecy, and underestimating the other side. When police found an opening, and it came precisely through communication and digital evidence, the internal castle began to crumble. The mental loop. Frustration, fantasy, planning, execution, relief, emptiness, repetition. To make it instructive and human, imagine BTK's loop as a closed circuit. Frustration and insignificance. Rader lives the ordinary life, routine, obligations, maybe criticism, maybe a sense of invisibility, maybe stored up anger. There doesn't have to be a big trauma that day. Sometimes, everyday life is enough to bruise the ego, being contradicted, not being admired, feeling small. Fantasy as refuge and ignition. The mind retreats to the internal secret room. Fantasies of domination, control, superiority. Fantasy offers an emotion real life doesn't offer. Centrality. Mental ritual and planning. The offender starts turning fantasy into script. Watches, imagines, rehearses mentally. For an organized offender, this phase is crucial. He doesn't want improv. He wants control. Execution. The crime happens as the culmination of the script. Without going into graphic details, BTK's pattern, according to case records, involved dominating and killing, largely by asphyxiation, strangulation, with a deviation by stabbing in one of the homicides. Relief and false peace. After the act, there's a drop in tension. He goes back to normal life. He may seem calm, even kind. The mask strengthens. I can. Emptiness, need to repeat. With time, the relief loses its effect. The emptiness returns. The ego gets hungry again for grandiosity. And the cycle reopens, sometimes after a long interval, sometimes with communication to reignite the stage. This loop is the psychological engine of many organized predators. It isn't only violence, it's dependency on an internal state of omnipotence. Vanity as weakness. Why did he fall? BTK was captured because his system had a crack. He needed to talk. He needed to be remembered. The investigation exploited that strategically. A classic example is the path that led to the floppy disk. By using digital material, Rader left traces that were fundamental in identifying links to his community life. From there, the net tightened with modern and classic methods: surveillance, data cross-checking, and confirmation through DNA, including the use of genetic kinship from a medical sample related to his daughter, according to widely reported records on the case. For someone who saw himself as superior, that's the perfect defeat. He didn't fall for being physically weaker or less cruel. He fell because he underestimated his own need for recognition. Behavior in court, control, language, and the absence of emotion. Transcripts of the proceedings show a defendant able to report facts with objectivity and little apparent emotion. That often shocks the public because people expect a breakdown or dramatic remorse. But in many organized profiles, the courtroom becomes just another stage, not necessarily for regret, but for control. The psychological point is, when someone doesn't integrate another person's suffering as something real and intimate, words become tools. And tools don't have guilt, they have function. Speech becomes a report. Confession becomes a final act of domination. I tell it, my way. Possible disorders. How to talk without closing a diagnosis. It's tempting to label, but the most responsible and most faithful to what serious psychology does is to say, there are patterns compatible with traits, not absolute certainties about diagnoses. In the BTK case, many analysts point to traits that resemble narcissistic traits, need for attention, grandiosity, self-naming, antisocial traits, extreme violation without empathy, obsessive traits, rigidity, order, control, and elements of sexual psychological sadism, gratification tied to domination. That doesn't explain or reduce the crime. It only describes a possible functioning that helps explain why he was so systematic. The heart of BTK, the hunger to be God for moments at the core, the BTK case seems to revolve around a central fantasy, the fantasy of being absolute, of deciding who lives and who dies, of commanding fear, of entering where no one wants evil to enter. Family, church, and steady work didn't cancel that fantasy. Maybe they helped feed it, offering contrast and a shield. Public life was the stage of the upright man. Secret life was the stage of the all-powerful man. And the greater the distance between the two, the greater the pleasure of the secret. The most painful question is, did he kill because he hated the victims? Probably not in a personal sense. In many organized predators, the victim is less a target of hatred and more an instrument. The real hatred may be toward an internal feeling, weakness, insignificance, not being admired. The victim becomes the object where he dumps and resolves that internal conflict, creating for moments an identity of dominance. Final and deep psychological conclusion. Why did he kill? Dennis Rader killed because he needed to feel total control, and because, for him, control was synonymous with existence. He killed because the fantasy of power seemed more important than any human bond. He killed because ordinary life wasn't enough to fill a narcissistic void and a compulsive need to feel superior. He killed because he turned people into symbols of an internal victory. I'm in charge, I decide, I'm seen. And even though it took the city decades to capture him, the ending shows a detail that defines BTK's psychology. The same hunger for recognition that sustained the myth was the weakness that took him down. ABA Part 8, The Final Reckoning, Lessons from the Darkness. When Dennis Rader was put in handcuffs, Wichita breathed like someone breaking the surface after holding their breath for too long. But arresting a man doesn't, by itself, undo what he poisoned. The BTK case ends in court, yes, with 10 consecutive life sentences. But it continues in the daily lives of the families and in the memory of a city that learned, in the most painful way, that terror doesn't always look like terror. Because the real shock of BTK isn't only the number of victims, 10 people killed between 1974 and 1991, largely by asphyxiation, strangulation, and 1 homicide by stabbing. The shock is the coexistence. The same man who chose a calculated nickname, bind, torture, kill, who wrote letters to be remembered and who came back from silence in 2004 out of boredom and a need for a stage, was also the man who went to church, had a family, and moved naturally through community spaces. There's an uncomfortable lesson in that, and it isn't distrust everyone. The lesson is harder. Social masks can be extremely effective, and certain profiles learn early how to imitate what society calls normal. BTK didn't need to be the strongest. He needed to be the most patient. He didn't need to look dangerous. He needed to look harmless. And when someone masters that art, the risk isn't only for those who become direct victims, it's for the entire community, which starts living with a kind of doubt that has no quick cure. Even so, there's another side to this story. The human, stubborn, and often invisible work of investigation. For decades, the case went cold. Then, when he started communicating again, the same vanity that fed him became the crack the police got through. A floppy disk, metadata, a link to his real life, and the absolute control castle started to fall. And that matters as a public message too. Organized predators aren't invincible. Sometimes they seem invincible because they choose their ground well, because they operate in cycles, and because real life is loud, full of urgencies competing for attention. But time, when it meets method, has a quiet power. BTK took decades to be captured, and that's a reminder of how slow justice can be. But it's also a reminder that fear doesn't have to be the final word. Still, there are questions a sentence doesn't close. What happens inside someone that makes recognition sought not through affection, but through terror? What kind of emptiness turns people into objects and the world into a stage? And most disturbing of all, how often does society get too fascinated with the figure of the criminal and forget that the real story is made of what was taken from someone? Future, family, routine, voice? Talking about true crime responsibly requires that shift in focus. The moral center is never the killer. The moral center is the victims and the survivors, and everything that remains afterward. Homes that never go back to being just homes, children who grow up with a permanent absence, neighborhoods that learn to lock their doors with a different feeling in their chest. And if there's any possible closure to this file, it has to go beyond curiosity. It has to touch prevention and social awareness without paranoia, strengthening community networks, taking reports and warning signs seriously, supporting mental health, and reducing the isolation that, in some dangerous profiles, becomes fuel for domination fantasies. That doesn't explain BTK, but it helps society avoid normalizing small abuses of power, small cruelties, small daily humiliations that, when ignored, become fertile ground for people who already carry a sick hunger for control. In the end, Wichita locked up a man. But the BTK case leaves a bigger, almost philosophical question. What is normalcy when it can be imitated perfectly? And another, even more uncomfortable. How often do we confuse a good reputation with a good soul? The file closes, the evidence room light goes out, but the reflection remains. Because understanding this kind of mind isn't admiration, it's prevention. It's looking into the abyss without romanticizing the abyss. It's remembering that behind 3 cold letters there were whole lives, and that the world owes them something stronger than fear, memory, respect, and an absolute refusal to turn horror into spectacle.